A lot of money was made by Richard Wells from nothing. He was very careful about managing everything in his life, including his work, his time, and even his feelings. He was always ready for anything. He was respected, had a lot of power, and had a good name. But all of that broke apart in an instant. What happens next will shock everyone. But before we start, let's do something fun. Comment your location below. Let's see who's watching from the farthest place. All right, let's begin. That night, he was enjoying a rare moment of solitude at his regular table in a fancy restaurant in the middle of New York City when an unexpected guest showed up. Not more than 8 years old, she was small and fragile. As she stood in front of him, her bright blue eyes met his with a surety that made him feel uneasy. Then she said 4 words that shook him to his core. "You're my dad." Richard Wells, a wealthy businessman who was used to the harsh world of business, felt the ground slip under him for the first time in years. It was just another night to begin with. Richard finally had some free time after a long day of talks right after each other. There was a soft hum of classical music in the restaurant, which blended in with the silence of people talking. The warm golden light from the chandeliers bounced off the shiny marble floors and made the room feel very luxurious. He had a perfectly cooked steak, a glass of the best red wine, and the pleasure of knowing he had just closed another deal worth $1 million for him. His life turned out just the way he had planned. Easily guessed. Well planned. In his hands, a shadow showed up at the edge of his table just as he lifted his fork. He thought it was the waiter at first. His hand stopped moving when he looked up, though. He saw a child standing there. She was not very tall and had golden blonde hair that was pulled back with a pale pink ribbon. She was neatly dressed in a simple dress, and her little hands were clasped together in front of her. She didn't get lost. It wasn't crying. She wasn't looking for a parent. She looked at him straight on, not blinking. Hold on. It was like she had been looking for him her whole life. She had a clear voice when she talked. Not too soft or too hard. Innocent but terrible. "You're my dad." It looked like there wasn't much air in the room. It got very quiet around him very slowly. Richard could feel his heart beating fast in his ears. He spoke, then shut up. The words that had just been said were hard for him to understand. Dad. Him. Not possible. That being said, as he looked at the child in front of him, he felt something strange in his chest. What was she? And why did her eyes look so familiar? Richard Wells had worked hard for years to make his life perfect. He started with nothing and built an empire. He shaped his world with accuracy, control, and unwavering desire. Everything about his life was carefully planned, from the places he ate at to the billion-dollar business deals he made. He had a plan for everything in his life. There was nothing surprising. Until tonight. An 8-year-old girl came up to his table tonight, looked him straight in the eye, and said 4 words that broke everything he thought he knew. "You're my dad." Richard felt his world tilt for the first time in a long time. He lost his hold on reality. The man had been in fierce competition, high-stakes talks, and the constant stress of running an empire. Now he was frozen in place, unable to understand the meaning of a child's words. He put down his fork, forgetting about the food in front of him. He slowly got up from his chair and looked at the girl standing in front of him with sharp eyes. His expensive red wine sat there unchanged. She looked about 8 years old and was very small. Her golden blonde hair was pulled back nicely with a pale pink ribbon. Her tiny hands were clasped in front of her like she had practiced this moment 100 times before she finally got the nerve to walk up to him. She wore a simple but clean dress. The thing that made Richard most nervous wasn't how she looked, but how she looked at him. She wasn't afraid. She didn't get lost. She wasn't looking for a parent. What she was looking for was already found. He was found. Even though her voice was soft, it was full of confidence. There was an unwavering certainty in it that made him feel uncomfortable. Richard's life was based on facts, logic, and reason the whole time. It didn't make sense to him at that time, though. He had no idea who this kid was. He didn't hang out with kids in general. His life was all about business, money, and power. His days were full of talks in boardrooms, trips on private jets, and events only for a select few. Something like this had no place to go. Still, She stood there without moving. She said, "Yes," again, but this time it was more firm. When she spoke, she was sure of what she was saying and took a slow, steady breath. "Hi, my name is Emily, and you're my dad." The air around Richard seemed to thicken. The faraway chatter of other diners became muffled. The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain plates faded into the background. It was as if time itself had stopped. His first reaction was disbelief. This had to be a mistake, a trick, a mistake. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he felt his pulse speed. Something about her nose curve, chin shape, and eyes that are so bright and blue. Something felt like it was old. Richard leaned back in his chair. He had a lot on his mind. He didn't have any kids. He had never been married. In the past, he had only been in short-term relationships that were never important enough to lead to this. Still, she was there. As he slowly let out a breath, his throat felt dry, and for the first time in years, his carefully held mask fell off. The waiter, who was coming up with a bottle of wine, stopped a few feet away because he could feel the stress at the table. Richard didn't even look at him. He sent the server away without saying a word, with a small wave of his hand. He was no longer hungry. "Excuse me." Richard's speech was low and controlled, but it also felt tight. Emily didn't move. She said it over and over, as if she wanted him to understand and agree with her. Richard's thoughts were fighting with each other. This couldn't happen, didn't it? The way she stood, the way she spoke, and the way she looked made him feel uneasy. His chest tightened in a way that he couldn't explain. What was she? Why did she look at him like she knew him? And why did he feel like he had lost control for the first time in his life? Richard Wells had to deal with talks worth billions of dollars, rough boardroom fights, and enemies who would do anything to stop him. But nothing had ever made him feel as unstable as the little girl in front of him. Still, the words, "You're my dad," hung heavy in the air, making it hard to breathe. Even though his heart was racing, he pushed himself to stay calm, and his businessman's mask fell into place. He had spent years getting better at controlling things. He was not going to lose it now. His voice was low, steady, and carefully emotionless. "Who told you that?" Emily paused for the first time. Her confidence was just a little bit shaken, and she looked down as if she were looking for strength. That's when she made up her mind and reached into the small bag that was over her shoulder. She carefully took out a folded piece of paper and put it on the table in front of Richard. He didn't say a word. The world moved more slowly. He didn't go for it right away. He just stared instead. It was just a plain piece of paper, but something about it made his stomach turn. After finally getting his hands to stay still, Richard leaned forward. He carefully unfolded the paper like it was a very important contract. But as soon as he saw the words inside, he felt like he had no air left in his lungs. His name, Richard Wells, written in big, clear letters. There was another word next to it that made him cold. Dad. Richard took a deep breath. His mind was running as he tried desperately to make sense of what he was seeing. His throat had dried up. There was something even worse at the end of the paper. Signing his name. A record of paternity. The law. The truth. Not a doubt. He couldn't see clearly. There were no longer any polished marble floors, golden chandeliers, or the quiet chatter of rich people eating in peace. His past came flooding back to him in jumbled pieces. A long time ago. Relationship that didn't last very long. A woman whose face he was having a hard time picturing right now. Could it be her? Was there any chance? Not at all. Not possible. Still, it was there. In front of him. The tiniest voice broke the dead quiet. "My mom, she passed away 2 weeks ago." Richard's head jerked up. Emily's small fingers curled a little against the fabric of her dress. Her voice was getting softer and quieter. "This paper was in her things that I found. I had never heard of you before from her." The words hurt him very much. Richard felt sick to his stomach. His fingers were clenched around the edges of the paper, holding on so tight that the edges were slightly wrinkled. She wasn't just a kid saying something that couldn't be true. She was by herself. Richard Wells didn't know what to say for the first time in a long time. Emily stood there, still and patient, looking at him with those sharp blue eyes, the same color he saw in the mirror every morning. At that very moment, He felt something very scary. Something not from here. He had been missing something for too long. Being responsible. Emily stood in front of him, with her little hands still tightly clasped in front of her. She looked way too grown up for her age. It was like she knew what was going to happen next wouldn't be easy. Richard forced himself to clear his throat, even though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was always like that when he was negotiating. His voice was low and steady. "Where have you been staying?" Emily paused for the first time. She lost a little of the confidence she had shown earlier, like a candle in the wind. Before she answered, she moved her weight from one foot to the other. "With a neighbor," she said in a low voice. "But she said she can't keep me for long." Richard felt something inside him get tighter. There was a sharp pain that cut through him that he didn't know or didn't want to know. His daughter, this girl, had nowhere to go. He couldn't figure out why the thought made him feel bad. His life had been planned out, organized, and exact. He wouldn't let interruptions or chaos happen. But now there was a little girl sitting across from him who had nowhere else to go. She had found him in some way. This time, he asked in a lower voice, "And your mother?" Emily's fingers were curled up a little against her dress. She looked down at the table, and the shadows from her long eyelashes fell on her pale face. "She got sick," she said in a low voice. "It took place quickly. She was fine one day. After that, she wasn't." Just a little. Her voice shook. She didn't cry, though. Richard quickly let out a sharp breath. His slow, steady breath did nothing to calm the storm that was building up inside him. Sarah. He hadn't thought about her in a long time. They met almost 10 years ago when he went to Chicago for work. She was bold, funny, and memorable, which made her stand out from the people he usually hung out with. Their time together was short. It was a whirlwind of desire that burned bright for a moment and then went out just as quickly. He was no longer there. He thought she had as well. She had never reached out, though. Didn't tell him. Don't ask for anything. She was no longer there. He felt a cold, strange weight in his chest. Feeling guilty. You might even feel bad about it. He wasn't certain. He rarely showed signs of being upset, but he ran his fingers through his well-styled hair. He asked, "Did she ever talk about me?" Even though he knew the answer. She shook her head no. No. That one word hurt more than he thought it would. "I only found out when I went through her things after she." Emily's small shoulders tensed up, as if she were bracing herself. Richard swallowed, even though his throat felt tight all of a sudden. Sarah did not tell him, because she did not want him to know. She raised their daughter by herself and never asked for help. He was never put in a part he didn't know he was meant to play. Because of this, he had lived his whole life unaware, while she had raised their child by herself. There was a heavy silence between them that lasted for too long. It was suffocating in the diner, which used to be a place of luxury and control. The low hum of talks, the sound of silverware clinking, and the smell of old wine all seemed so far away from what was happening in front of him. The quiet was finally broken by Emily. She was careful with her words. "Watched. I don't want anything from you." Richard jerked. I didn't know where else to go." What she said hurt. Did she think he would just walk away? Richard Wells, one of the most important men in New York, felt helpless for the first time in his life. And it scared him. Did she really think he would say no? The fact that he wouldn't care that she was his child? Richard Wells had spent years building his business and making sure that control, accuracy, and efficiency ruled every part of his life. He liked having things in order and making the right decisions at the right time. There was no room for problems to happen. There's no room for error. There's also no room for being a father. He was sitting next to an 8-year-old girl, though, who had just turned his whole world upside down. His mind kept going back to Emily's words. "Please don't do anything for me." I did not know where to go. He wasn't ready for how deeply that quiet statement hurt him. He didn't seem to care, she thought. And maybe he wouldn't have if she had come in a few hours earlier, before he saw the truth in her eyes, and before he saw how much they were alike. But as he stared at this weak little girl holding on to a worn-out piece of paper like it was the only thing that was stable, something changed inside him. She didn't have anyone else. He felt something strange and unpleasant when he thought about it. Feeling guilty? Who is responsible? He had no idea. No matter what it was, it wouldn't leave him alone. Richard let out a slow breath as he forced himself to think and make a choice. There was just one option. He sat up straight, carefully folded the paper, and set it down on the table. He told her, "You'll stay with me tonight." Even though he wasn't sure what the hell he was doing, his voice was strong and steady. Emily looked up at him and blinked, clearly shocked, but she said yes. Richard Wells wasn't thinking about himself for the first time ever. Richard led Emily out of the restaurant. He was still confused about everything that had happened in such a short time. It was colder outside, and the city lights looked fuzzy against the dark sky. He felt heavy from what he had just done. That's when the valet pulled up in front of the restaurant and stopped his sleek black Mercedes S-Class. Richard took Emily's key fob and opened the passenger door for her. She wasn't sure what to do and held on to the strap of her small bag. His words, "You can sit in the front," made her feel better, but he didn't know why. She climbed in after a short pause. The big plush interior made Emily's small frame look even smaller. As she carefully clicked the seatbelt into place, it almost wrapped around her. Richard went around to the driver's side and slid into his seat with ease. He pushed the starter button, and the engine started right away. He didn't move for a moment, though. He had his hands on the driving wheel, and his knuckles were turning white as he realized what was going on. It wasn't a deal. For business reasons, he couldn't talk his way out of this deal. This was his life now. He had a daughter. He had no idea what to do next. Once they were out of the busy restaurant, Richard felt the truth of the situation hit him like a heavy weight. He had a daughter. He had been gone for 8 years, leaving behind a child. He was a child who had never heard his name or known about him. She never expected him to be there for her. Then she got into his car and drove to his house, which was never meant to have a child live there. The thought made him feel uneasy. In an effort to calm down, he cleared his throat. This was the same calm he brought to all important business meetings. Tonight, though, it felt different. Forced. "Do you have anything with you?" "Clothes?" "A bag." Even though his speech was calm, there was something else there that didn't sound right. Emily shook her head and played with the bottom of her dress. "My neighbor took my backpack from me." "There aren't many things in it." Richard got a tighter grip on the driving wheel. She didn't have much. He felt something else strange and almost painful when he thought about it. This man owned several expensive homes across the country, so many brand suits that they took up whole closets, and cars that cost more than some people make in a lifetime. Still, his own daughter didn't have much. It was his fault. It was still his fault, even if he hadn't known about her. As he drove out of the parking lot, he forced the thought to go away by breathing out through his nose. The city lights flashed by quickly and bounced off of his car's sleek black hood. The quiet in the car went on for a long time. No one spoke. Last but not least, Emily spoke. "Where do you live?" "Midtown," was the obvious answer. "The top floor of a building." She gave a nod but didn't say anything else. Richard quickly looked at her. She had her little hands in her lap and was looking out the window. The way her eyes drooped and her body slouched against the seat showed that she was tired, even though she looked calm. He didn't want to admit it, but that picture made him feel very uneasy. He asked, "When was the last time you ate?" After a long pause, Emily wasn't sure what to say, like the answer wasn't important. She said, "This morning," in a soft voice. Richard clenched his teeth. This morning. It was full of food, and she hadn't said a word about being hungry while they were there. "I should have known." He didn't mean for his voice to be so sharp. "I would have put in an order for you." Emily just gave a shrug. It was my choice not to ask. That answer, that quiet, simple answer, hit him like a punch in the gut. She was used to not having anything. She didn't ask very often. That awareness burned through him and left him with a strange feeling that felt a lot like shame. Richard had been living a lavish lifestyle for years, while making deals worth millions of dollars with the world's richest businessmen. But tonight, the fact that this child, his child, was hungry but didn't ask for food, it broke him. It was quiet for the rest of the drive. After a short time, they pulled into his building's underground parking area. The only sound in the quiet was the engines, sound bouncing off the walls. Richard got out of the car and walked to the passenger side. Emily didn't think about it for long before putting her little hand in his outstretched one. Richard Wells felt something he had never felt before for the first time in his life. How heavy it is to be a dad. Emily thought about putting her little hand in his for a moment before she did. It was cold on her fingers. Richard saw, but didn't say anything. Neither the cold night air nor something else, something deeper, made him feel that way. A cold that wasn't caused by the weather, but by something much harder to fix. There was a lot of silence in the lift. Emily studied him with eyes that were way too sharp for her age as she looked up at him. "Are you this quiet all the time?" Richard wasn't ready for the question. Still, he had been called many things in his life, like cruel, eager, and scary, but he was never quiet. But after a moment, he gave an honest answer. "I don't often have guests over without warning." Emily gave a yes answer as if it made sense. "I know you don't like surprises." "No." She turned her head a little. "Well, I guess I'm a bother for you." The way she spoke was light and almost playful, but there was something deeper going on. Richard let out a sigh and ran his hand through his hair. "Emily, you're not a bother. This is just new." A quiet chime let the elevator door slide open, showing the door to his penthouse. Emily's heart stopped as soon as they walked inside. Her big blue eyes went over the tall floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the city's sparkling lights, the sleek, modern furniture that was perfectly arranged in a circle, and the grand piano that stood in the corner like an expensive piece of art. There was nothing dirty, not clean enough. Emily took a few slow steps forward and then turned around slowly. "You live by yourself here?" "Yes." She looked for a long time at the tall bookcases and the abstract art on the walls. She finally turned back to him after that. "It's really clean." Richard almost laughed. "Someone takes care of it for me." She seemed to find that answer funny. As she looked around, she walked in further and lightly ran her fingers along the back of a leather chair. She looked at the place where he lived as if she wanted to figure out who he was. She finally looked at him again. "Where am I going to sleep?" Richard took a break. He hadn't thought about that question. The 3 guest rooms were all decorated in the same modern, classy way as the rest of the apartment, but none of them were made for kids. He pointed down the hall. "Down there is a room. For now, you can use it." Emily quietly followed him. Her small steps on the smooth hardwood floor barely made a sound. The guest room was a large, neutral-colored bedroom with a queen-sized bed, a mahogany desk, and a sitting area near the window that he could see when he turned on the light. There was nothing wrong with it. Way too good. Emily stood at the entry for a while, holding on to the purse strap. "The room doesn't feel like a kid's room." Richard was unsure. He looked around to try to understand how she felt. The furniture was cold and formal. The soft sounds. The lack of life and warmth. It looked like a hotel room. "It's not a bedroom. Not a house." That thought made his chest tighten up for some reason. But Emily didn't complain. Her bag was already on the chair when she walked in. She then looked back at him with a quiet look that said, "I get it." She wasn't hoping for warmth. She wasn't expecting to get home, since she had never had one before. In fact, that was the thing that scared Richard the most. Richard moved around awkwardly and ran his hand through his hair. "I didn't think a child would be here." Emily didn't seem upset by what was said. She just nodded, as if it made sense, and as if she was used to being someone else's thought after their own. It was hard for Richard to understand why that thought made him feel bad. After a short pause, she spoke again, but this time her voice was soft. "May I sleep with the light on?" He wasn't ready for that question. He had made choices worth billions of dollars every day since he was an adult, but he had no idea what he was doing when he stood in the doorway of a guest room that seemed too clean to belong to a child. Of course, he moved to the table next to the bed and turned on the lamp, which gave the room a warm glow. Emily went over to the bed and sat down, bouncing a little as if she wanted to see how soft it was. She looked almost happy for a split second, but the time went by too fast. The little girl pulled her legs up and tucked them under her. Her hands were on the thick blanket. She looked so little while she was sitting there. Richard stood in the opening for a while, not sure what to do. He knew how to organize and boss people around. He owned businesses, made deals, and led boards with the ease of someone who always knew what to do. He didn't know what to say or do, or what the hell was going to happen next. "Do you need anything else?" He meant for his voice to be louder. She gave it some thought, and then shook her head. "I feel fine." Richard was unsure. "All right, go to sleep." She leaned back against the pillows and pulled the blankets up to her chin. He felt something strange and uncomfortable in his chest when he saw it. "Good night, Mr. Wells." It was there again. That name. "Hey, Mr. Wells." The way she said it made him feel like he didn't know her. He took the lump in his throat in. "Hey, Emily, good night." He then turned off the light above and walked into the hallway, leaving the door slightly open. He let out a heavy breath and rubbed his face as he walked back to his own room. He had just put his daughter to sleep. He had a girl he didn't know about. Richard Wells didn't know what would happen tomorrow for the first time in years. Richard didn't get much sleep that night. He was on his back and looking at the ceiling. He had a lot of thoughts that he couldn't put into words. How did he not know he had a child for 8 years? Why didn't Sarah tell him? Had she done it to be mean? Because they're proud? Or did she really think he wouldn't care? He didn't know what to do now that Emily was here. His whole life was based on accuracy, being able to guess. He had never thought about having kids or wanted to have a family. Now, though, he had no choice. He fell into an uneasy sleep after a while because he was so tired. But early in the morning, he woke up because of a faint noise. It took him a moment to lay still and listen. Not a lot of noise. The sound of a door opening. His gut told him what to do. He sat up and ran his hand over his face. His mind was still fuzzy from sleep. Then it dawned on him. Sheila. Putting on a t-shirt, he quietly left his room and walked down the hall. The guest room's light was still on, and the door was just a little open. He took a look inside. What he saw made his chest get tight. She was sitting in the chair by the window with her knees pulled up to her chest and looking out at the skyline of the city. He had left her clothes out for her, but she hadn't changed into them yet. Her dress from yesterday was still on her, and she still had that small bag clutched against her stomach, as if letting go of it would make her disappear. She wasn't asleep. She had been there for a long time. Richard crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Are you going to stay up all night?" Emily took a small jump, startled. She blinked as she turned her head toward him. "I couldn't sleep." As he walked in, the soft light from the lamp cast shadows all over the room. "Why not?" She wasn't sure. "I didn't want to close my eyes and wake up somewhere else," she said quietly. He wasn't ready for how hard the words would hit him. She was scared. "I was afraid this would only last for a short time." She was scared that if she went to sleep, she would wake up in a shelter, with strangers, or even worse, by herself. Richard took a deep breath, then got up from the bed, took off a blanket, and walked over to where she was sitting. He put it over her small shoulders, without saying a word. Emily jerked a little, shocked, but she didn't say anything. He finally told her, "You're not going anywhere." "Not tonight." "Not tomorrow." "That's not a problem." She didn't answer right away. She moved after a moment and pulled the cover tighter around herself. She looked like a child again for the first time since she came into his life. Not like a child who had grown up being on her own. Richard let out a sigh and ran his hand through his hair. What the hell was he going to do next? He knew for sure that his life had changed. Always. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed when Richard found her. She was hunched over and her shoulders were pulled in, as if she was trying to look tiny. He saw that she was still wearing her socks even though she was wearing one of his t-shirts that was too big on her. Something inside him ached at the sight. It seemed like she didn't fit in this huge, clean penthouse because she looked weak and too young. Because she had been sleeping. Her blonde hair was a little messy, with strands falling over her face. She had something tightly in her small hands. Richard crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, not able to sleep. When Emily saw him, she jumped a little and turned to face him. "Sorry, I meant not to wake you up." Richard turned his head away. "No problem." He thought about it for a moment before going further into the room. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer for a moment. After a while, she slowly uncurled her fingers, showing a small, folded picture. His chest got tight. As she held it out to him, He moved closer. The edges were worn, and the picture was a little blurry. He knew right away that it was Sarah. She was happy and putting her arm around Emily, who looked like she was only 4 or 5 years old. Richard took a deep breath in and sat down next to her on the bed, still looking at the picture. Sarah wasn't seen by him in a long time, but now that I see her face, he felt like he got hit in the gut. Feel bad. Feeling guilty. A strange, painful kind of loss. Emily barely raised her voice above a whisper and said, "I didn't want to forget her." Richard sucked down the lump in his throat. He turned the picture over in his hands and ran his fingers along the old paper. He said in a low voice, "You won't." Emily looked up at him with something in her green eyes that he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Did you love her?" He wasn't ready for the question. "Love?" He slowly let out a breath and ran his hand over his face. "I cared about her." He took another look at the picture, but we didn't stay together for long. We broke up before I knew she was pregnant. Emily gave a nod as if she knew the answer already. "She didn't say anything about you. Not even once. It shouldn't have hurt that much, but it did happen in some way." It took Richard 24 hours to fully understand why Sarah had kept Emily a secret from him. But hearing Emily say it made it feel even more real. She was so clear and sure of herself. He slightly tightened his grip on the picture. "Do you think she was mad at you?" Emily asked with a shaky, almost weak voice. Richard thought about that for a short time. Was she? Because she was mad, would she have kept Emily from him? Because they were angry? Or did she really think he wouldn't have wanted this life? He took a deep breath. "I'm not sure." As his daughter looked at his face, waiting for an answer, he looked down at her. "Perhaps she thought I wouldn't want to be a dad." A beat of silence. Then Emily turned her head, just a little. "Could you have?" Richard's throat got tight. Would he have taken the lead? Would he have been a different person if Sarah had told him then? Or would he have been too busy with work and afraid of the responsibility? Back then, his life was all about being in charge, getting ahead. He judged everything by how much money, power, and acquisitions it brought him. But being a dad, that wasn't something you could figure out. He said, "I don't know." But this time his voice was rougher than before. Emily didn't seem shocked. More than anything, she seemed to know way too well what it's like to live in fear. She took one last look at the picture, and then carefully folded it up and put it in the pocket of her t-shirt. He was shocked when she leaned against him. Just a little. He could feel her warmth against his arm just enough. Richard did not move. It wasn't even important. It felt like a huge thing, though. He raised his arm slowly and hesitantly and wrapped it around her shoulders. Emily didn't move away. He let her lean into him for the first time since she came into his life. She let herself be a child, a daughter. And Richard Wells wasn't thinking about the past or the future for the first time in a long time. He was just here, having a seat next to his daughter, trying to hold on to a moment he never thought he'd have. Richard slowly let out a breath as he looked at his daughter with a steady gaze. He told her, "I don't know what kind of father I'll be, Emily." His voice was quieter than before, "But I know I'm not going to leave now." Emily looked at him with her green eyes for a long time, as if she were trying to figure out how sincere he was in what he said. Finally, after what seemed like forever, she gave a nod. "All right." There was a calm, unhurried silence between them. Just be quiet. Richard didn't feel the need to fill it this time. "Are you hungry?" he asked to break the silence. Emily's face showed a flash of something, maybe amusement, and her lips moved a little. A little. Richard got up. "Let's go find something." They went to the kitchen, which was a sleek, modern room that was made to look good more than be used. Richard didn't like to cook very often. He liked having private chefs or room service at one of his many hotels make his meals. But tonight, the thought of having someone else make their food made them feel tidy. Emily sat on a bar stool and watched him. She put her small hands on the cool marble counter and looked at him. "Do you cook for yourself sometimes?" Richard smiled as he took the food out of the fridge. "Almost never," Emily thought as she lightly stomped her feet on the stool. "When I couldn't sleep, my mom always made pancakes." She said it in a casual way that made his chest tighten. It was like she was wishing for something. Richard took out a box of eggs. In that case, pancakes it is. Emily looked shocked. Do you know how? As he reached for the flour, he gave her a sideways look. I can do what I'm told. Emily put her hands under her chin and watched him walk around the kitchen. With her there, the space didn't seem as scary. More alive. Better. Emily didn't say anything while he mixed the batter. She seemed to be thinking. She didn't say anything else until he started turning the pancakes. I'm not sure how long I should stay here. Richard stopped moving for a second as the spatula hung in the air. Then he carefully put the pancake on the plate. He looked at her. You don't have anywhere else to go. She turned her head away. No. He put the plate in front of her and looked at her to make sure she understood what he was going to say. Okay, stay here for as long as you need to. Emily hesitated and picked up her fork as she thought about what he had said. She slowly nodded after that. All right. Even though it was only one word, it meant a lot more than he thought. Richard felt like he had made the right choice for the first time since she came into his life. He might not have known how to be a dad. He might still not fully understand what was going on. He was sure of one thing, though. She couldn't leave without him. Richard was not letting her go. He had this thought all night, even though he couldn't fall asleep. It lingered in his mind like a midnight promise. However, morning came too quickly. When he woke up, his body was tired, but his mind was sharp. His house wasn't empty for the first time in years. He had someone living with him for the first time in years, someone who needed him. That realization was both reassuring and scary. He got out of bed and rolled his shoulders as he walked to the kitchen. Like every other morning, he thought it would be quiet. He was shocked when it wasn't. Emily had already shown up. Sitting at the counter, she put her small body on one of the sleek bar stools and swung her feet around while she ate a piece of toast. Because she had slept, her blonde hair was a little tangled, and the way she sat made me think she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. Richard blew his nose. You're up early. Emily looked at him, but it was hard to tell what she was thinking. I had no idea what to do when I woke up. He was surprised by how hard that simple comment hit him. This was new for her. She wasn't used to waking up somewhere that made her feel like home. Richard put his hand on the counter and carefully watched her. He told her, You don't have to just sit here. You can read a book, watch TV, or look around the apartment. Emily looked around as she wrapped her small hands around her half-eaten toast. It's really quiet where you are. Richard leaned against the counter and took a sip of his coffee. I guess I didn't notice before. Emily looked at him with her head tilted a little. What do you do all day at home? He gave a small smirk. Do something. She scrunched up her nose. Finally, that's it. Emily made a face. That sounds dull. Richard laughed out loud at that. Most people don't find running a business dull. She shrugged and ate another piece of toast. Mom worked all the time, too. We always had time together, though. Richard took a moment to think about what she said. He put down his coffee. What did you do with your mom? Emily's face got a little softer, and she ran her fingers along the edge of her plate. We go to the park or bake cookies sometimes. She liked to draw, so she showed me how to do it. She had a small smile on her face. She was busy all the time, but she still found time for me. When Richard gulped, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Sarah did a lot to make Emily's life good. Also, he didn't even know. That man hadn't been there. Sarah was taking care of their daughter by herself, while he was busy with business deals, wealth, and power. Now Emily was in his house, sitting in front of him like a broken piece of his past and future mixed together. Richard let out a slow breath. I ought to have been there. Emily looked at him with a face that couldn't be read. But then, after a short time, she just nodded. Yes. She didn't say it in a mean or angry way. Just a simple, quiet truth. That made it hurt even more. Richard cleared his throat and shifted his weight a little. Having to think about someone else and his daily plans wasn't something he was used to. Boardrooms, bank sheets, and profit margins were all important to him. Not breakfast and talking in the morning. Well, he said, trying to get his thoughts together. We'll figure something out. After work, we might do something fun. Emily's eyes got a little brighter, and her interest grew. Like what? Richard was unsure. He wasn't really the fun type. He was in charge of business talks, networking events, and private galas. How did most people spend their free time? He shook his head. I'll think of something. Emily didn't seem sure. She didn't argue, though. Richard looked at the time and let out a sigh. He had an important meeting in an hour that he couldn't miss. But when he looked at Emily sitting in his clean, shiny kitchen, he knew he couldn't leave her there all day. That didn't work in this case. He carefully watched her face as he said, I have to go to work for a few hours. But I'll have someone watch over you. Emily made a face. I don't need someone to watch my kids. Richard gave a small smirk. You're 8. I can handle things on my own. He sighed. I'm sure of that. You won't spend the whole day sitting here by yourself, though. Emily crossed her arms and made a hard line with her lips. I'm not used to having other people help me. Richard looked at her as if he knew. You should get used to it. A sharp knock at the door cut them off before Emily could argue. When Richard turned around and walked toward the door, he saw Natalie standing there. Natalie was his helper, right-hand woman, and the person who had been running his life for 5 years. She was in her early 30s and looked very good in a navy blue suit. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Quick, calm, and always 5 steps ahead. She looked back and forth between Richard and Emily, her well-trained eyes briefly lighting up with interest before she returned her attention to her boss. Good morning, sir. You said it was important. Richard moved out of the way and pointed to Emily. Please stay with her for a while. Natalie took a quick blink. With her. Emily waved her hand around in a weird way. Hi. Natalie thought about it for a split second before giving a polite nod. Hi. After that, she went back to Richard and was very serious. Sir, you have 3 meetings today, one of which is a conference call with the London office. I can't set them up again. Natalie gave me a strange look. Change the date of the meeting with foreign investors? Richard let out a sigh and ran his hand through his hair. Okay, I'll answer that call now. Put the others away. Natalie gave a small smile and a nod. Changes at the last minute were nothing new for her. But this, it was new. She put her arms together and looked again at him and Emily. May I please ask what's going on, sir? Richard gave Emily a quick look. The little girl sat there quietly and watched the talk as if she were not a part of it. Her posture was awkward, as if she were still figuring out where she fit in this world. That made his choice easy for some reason. He looked Natalie in the eye. She's my daughter. She had a rare look of surprise on her face. She did get better quickly, though. I see. She didn't sound mad in her tone. Just a nod of recognition. That was nice of Richard. Natalie looked at Emily again, and this time her serious face softened a bit. Okay, Emily, do you like pancakes with chocolate chips? Because I'm really good at making them. Emily thought about what to do for a moment before her lips moved into the smallest smile. I'm not sure. Are they better than Richard's? Richard laughed. Please. Anything is better than mine. Natalie gave a laugh. Kids are smart. Richard felt a little less like a stranger in his own home for the first time since Emily had come. Richard could hardly hear the noise in the office because it was so busy. The steady hum of keyboards clicking, the whispered chatter of his workers, and the distant ring of phones were the sounds of his everyday life. A world he knew well. It was a world where every move and choice were planned. But today, it didn't matter at all. His thoughts were not on the papers on his desk or the numbers that were flashing on his screen. It was somewhere else, in his apartment, where a girl of 8 years old was waiting for him. His kid. In his mind, the words were still strange, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. With a sigh of frustration, Richard leaned back in his chair and rubbed his head. All morning, he had hardly done anything. He tried hard to concentrate, but one thought kept coming back to him. Was Emily okay? Emails and meetings felt like background noise. He had never been this worried about someone else. He finally gave up and took his phone out of his pocket. He called Natalie and then waited. After a few rings, she picked up. Sir, he asked in a relaxed way, as if he hadn't been thinking about it all morning. How's it going? There was a short pause before she spoke again. She's not like the other people you hang out with most of the time. Richard gave a small grin and rolled his pen between his fingers. So that means she's not interested in expensive suits or stock market trends. Right? Natalie spoke in a dry way. Not at all. He laughed and shook his head. That's not a surprise. Natalie went on. But she's polite. And very independent for being 8 years old. That made Richard think. On their own. It was clear that she was, right? Sarah had raised her by herself. Emily had learned to depend on herself, since she didn't have anyone else to turn to. The thought made him feel uneasy. He asked her, "What is she doing now?" Natalie thought about what to say for a moment before saying, "She's drawing." She said her mom taught her. Richard could feel his chest getting tight. Sarah used to draw. That was new to him. He didn't know a lot of things. Sarah's life and Emily's life had gone on without him. During some years, he had never been a part of any memories. The truth hurt more than he wanted to say for a man who took pride in always being in charge. Slowly letting out a breath, he pressed his fingers against his forehead. "All right. I'll be home soon." Natalie didn't say anything about his sudden choice to leave work early. She just said, "Understood." And the call was over. People in Richard's office looked at him funny as he got up, grabbed his suit jacket, and walked out the door. He was leaving work early for the first time in years. Richard's first thought when he walked into his apartment was how it felt different. His home was usually very quiet, almost too quiet. It was a cold, modern place that showed how he lived. He thought he smelled something sweet when he walked in today, though. What about pancakes? He made a small frown. He looked at Emily, who was sitting on the floor of the living room with her legs crossed and colored pencils and paper all around her. She was so focused on her drawing that she didn't even notice him at first. Her blonde hair was in a messy bun. Natalie, who was sitting close and holding a tablet, raised her head. "You got back early." Richard gave a shrug and put his keys on the counter. "I thought I'd stop by." Emily then looked up and blinked in shock. "Are you already home?" Richard laughed. "What? Do you think I'll leave you here all day?" She looked at him for a moment before turning her head to the side. "I'm not sure. It looks like you work a lot." Natalie laughed. "She's not wrong." Richard gave her a look, but he wasn't really mad at her. When he got close, he looked down at the drawing Emily was making. The buildings were colored in soft, mixed shades of orange and pink, and the picture showed a city skyline at sunset. He told her, "You're good." Emily gave a shy smile. "My mom taught me." It was there again, that pull in his chest. He shook his head. He looked at the empty plate on the couch table and asked, "So, pancakes?" Emily made a face. "She made them, Natalie. Theirs were better than yours." Richard put his hand over his heart to act like he was angry. "That hurts. That is betrayal." Natalie gave a laugh. "I told you." Emily laughed, and Richard felt something change for the first time since she got there. It was still there, the stress and the doubt, but something else was also getting bigger. Something different. Something that helped him understand that this might not have been the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Richard walked into the kitchen. The smooth floor made his steps sound light. There was still a faint smell of pancakes in the air, mixed with the smell of new paper and chalk. He was shocked by what he saw, which was strangely warm. Emily was drawing very hard while sitting at the kitchen counter. With a colored pencil tucked between her small fingers, she carefully moved them over the paper. Her tongue stuck out a little to show that she was paying attention. Natalie was sitting on a bar stool across from her, with her legs crossed and her back straight. She had a tablet on her lap. She was reading, but every once in a while, her eyes darted to Emily, as if she was still trying to figure out what was going on. Richard could feel his chest getting tight. His kid, his house, his life. There were lots of quick changes. He walked over and looked down at Emily's paper after clearing his throat. "What are you writing?" She was a little startled by his voice and paused before turning the sketch pad over for him to see. Richard wasn't sure what he thought would happen, but this is definitely not it. It was a drawing of them together. Richard stood next to her in the picture. He was tall and calm, and the suit he was wearing was drawn with surprisingly fine detail. His smaller hand was on Emily's smaller one, and their fingers were touching. There were no fancy settings or extras that weren't needed. Only them. He couldn't speak for a moment. She had brought them together. Like this was always how they were. Like they had always been there. Emily carefully looked at his face, her green eyes looking for a response. "Do you like it?" Richard nodded and swallowed the strange lump in his throat. "Okay. It's good." Emily smiled, showing that she was happy with his answer. Natalie then stood up and smoothed out her skirt as she looked back and forth between them. "I'm leaving now. Please call me if you need anything." Richard thanked her and nodded. "Thank you, Natalie." After hesitating for a moment, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door. As soon as it clicked shut behind her, there was a strange but not uncomfortable pause between them. Emily was still staring at him while her pencil tapped against the counter. She told him, "You left work early." Richard gave a shrug and walked over to the fridge. "Thought I'd check on things here." Emily cocked her head and smiled. "Have you missed me?" Richard gave me a strange look. "Not even a day has passed since you got here." "That doesn't mean no." He let out a sigh and spun off the cap of a bottle of water. "Don't get used to it." Emily laughed and shook her head as she went back to drawing. Richard looked at her for a while. Something about her at that moment made me feel so at ease, so natural and open. It was strange. She had only been in his space for a day, but she was already making herself at home. His life. What might have been even stranger was that he was okay with it. Richard would have laughed if someone told him a week ago that his whole world was about to fall apart. He had worked hard for years to make his life safe and controlled. Every choice was carefully thought out. Every move is planned. He watched an 8-year-old girl draw at his kitchen counter, though, as if she had always been there. She hadn't, though. She hadn't seen him in years. She thought she didn't have a father for years. Years thinking she was the only person in the world, while he had no idea she existed. The thought made him feel sick. He watched her as he leaned against the counter. "Oh, Emily." She looked at him with wide eyes and a blink. "You said earlier that you didn't know how long you were going to stay here." Emily slightly nodded, but her face couldn't be read. Rich let out a sigh. He didn't expect the words to feel so heavy. "You're not going anywhere." Her eyes got a little bigger. "Really?" He said yes. "I'm not going to act like I do know what I'm doing. You're my daughter, though. That's not going to change." "Okay, you stay here. This is now your home." Emily didn't say anything for a long time. She took in his words like they were heavy, letting them sink into every crack that life had left in her. She slowly smiled after that. Not any smile, though. It felt good. Hope. There's something more to it than that. Something real but fragile. She just whispered, "Okay." Richard didn't know how much he needed to hear that sentence until she said it, because this wasn't just changing her life. He had changed too. The next few days were unlike anything Richard had ever been through. His life had gone from being well-planned and reliable to something completely different, messy, unpredictable, and strangely satisfying. It wasn't just checking emails and getting ready for meetings in the morning anymore. Now, they included making sure Emily ate breakfast, learning how to style a child's hair, which he quickly found to be a lot harder than he thought it would be, and changing his plans to fit the little person who had become the center of his attention. It was weird at first. Richard didn't like having other people in his space. He wasn't used to hearing small, hurried footsteps running down the hall when he woke up, hearing cartoons chattering in the background, or finding tiny socks and colored pencils all over his apartment, which had been cleaned the night before. It was always quiet in his world. That made people laugh. A lot of questions, none of which were filtered, made him stop and think about things he hadn't thought about before. Why do people dress up for work? It feels like a mask, doesn't it? Can money buy happiness if it can buy anything else? Since Mom always said it couldn't. Have you ever looked for work that wasn't in business? Richard didn't always know what to do. Even so, he felt like he had to answer them. Emily would sometimes sit at the bar and swing her feet while he made coffee. They would talk about things he didn't fully understand but still found interesting. In the evenings, she would sometimes fall asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket and with a book in her hands. And before going to sleep every night, he couldn't help but check on her. to make sure she was still there, to make himself remember that this was real, that she was real, and his life wasn't just work and success for the first time in years. There was more to it than that. It was about her. Even though he had to make a lot of changes, deal with unexpected routines, and have his once perfectly planned life thrown off, Richard found himself liking it. He wasn't sure when it had taken place, when the 8-year-old girl's presence stopped feeling like an invasion and began to feel like something else, something that fit. But it did. After a long day at work, Richard came home one night and stopped in the hallway of his penthouse. He used to come in too quietly, but what he saw now was very different. Emily was reading a book while sitting on the floor of the living room with her legs crossed. There were a lot of books around her, some open and some stacked in a way that looked like she was looking for the right story. As she read, the light from a lamp nearby cast soft shadows over her face, and her blonde hair fell into her eyes. Richard did nothing but watch her for a moment. The way her little fingers read the words on the page, the way her brows wrinkled showed that she was focused and lost in whatever world she had fallen into. He finally put his suitcase down and let out a sigh. "What are you reading?" Emily pulled her hair back and looked up. "Just one of the books on your shelf." "I was bored." Richard gave me a strange look. "You like to read?" She smiled. "Books take you to new places, even if you're stuck in the same one," Mom always said. He stopped to think about what she said. Emily's short life had been full of hard things. She lost her mother, not knowing what will happen. She was thrown into a new world with a father she didn't know much. She did have a quiet power about her, though, that he hadn't expected. Going over to the couch, Richard sat down and stretched his legs out. He let out a breath. "What kinds of books do you like?" Emily tapped her fingers on the cover for a moment as she thought. "Ghosts. There are also stories about people who figure things out." Richard laughed. "You'd be good at being a detective." She laughed. "Perhaps. I think I'd rather be an artist, though." Richard looked over at the sketchpad that was lying next to her. It was full of drawings, some very simple and some very elaborate. A lot of the time, she drew what she saw, which made the moments feel more real than any picture could. He was especially interested in one picture. It was a picture of him at his desk, looking serious, with his mouth set. Richard laughed and picked it up. "You got my business face just right." Emily made a face. "That's how you always look." He laughed and shook his head. "I don't." "You do." After a big sigh, Richard set the picture down. "I guess I need to work on that." Emily laughed and turned to a new page in her notebook. "The next time I draw you, I might make you smile." Richard laughed as he watched her draw with her pencil across the page. She was already lost in her work again. He understood that his home was more than just a place to sleep for the first time in years. It was living. Richard crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "Go ahead." Emily was so excited as she started working on a new page in her sketchbook. The only sounds in the room for a few minutes were her pencil scratching against the paper and Richard's fingers tapping on his phone screen every once in a while as he read through emails. He wasn't really paying much attention to his texts, though. There were sneaky looks he kept giving her. She was totally focused. Her small fingers were moving quickly, and she had a serious look on her face. She often stuck her tongue out a little when she was thinking deeply. It was really simple. I just watched a kid draw. Still, Richard couldn't think of the last time something had made him feel so real. Emily finally let out a happy sigh and turned the sketchpad over to show him. When Richard looked at the picture, he felt something change inside him. He wasn't the only one at his desk like before. It was different this time. She drew them both sitting next to each other. He wasn't acting like he always does when he's in business. He seemed calm and at ease, like he belonged there. Like a dad. He wasn't ready for the lump that formed in his throat. Emily carefully watched him as she held the edge of the sketchpad with her little fingers. "Do you like it?" Richard took a deep breath and held his voice steady. "Okay." "Yes." She smiled, and it was one of those rare, real smiles that makes you feel good. After some silence, she said in a soft voice, "I'm glad I found you." Richard let out a breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "Yes, kid." And the crazy part? He meant it. He had tight control over his life a week ago. He had meetings, investments, and dinners with people who talked about stock percentages and business plans, all worked out to the minute. He now had an 8-year-old who drew on his desk, watched cartoons in the background of his high-rise apartment, and threw his perfectly ordered world into chaos. And this is the first time. He was okay with it. When Richard walked into the kitchen in the morning, Emily was standing on a chair with her arms stretched as high as they could go. She was trying to reach the closet above the counter. She stood on her toes and touched the edge of the cereal box with her fingers, but she couldn't quite reach it. Richard smiled as he leaned against the opening. "Need some help?" She huffed and crossed her arms. "No, I'm on my own." Richard laughed and walked over. "All right, for sure, Miss Independent. If you break your neck while falling off that chair, I'll have to tell the doctors that. And I'd rather not." He reached up and easily grabbed the box, putting it on the counter. Emily narrowed her eyes at him, but didn't say anything. She let out a big sigh. "Okay, it looks like being tall has some pros." Richard laughed. "Thank you for seeing the value in my life." She laughed and jumped off the chair. "Don't get used to it." Richard shook his head and made himself a coffee while Emily got a bowl. It was just a normal scene, but it wasn't at all, because he didn't know she existed a week ago. She was now a part of his life. It could be the most important part. The box of cereal was easy for Richard to get out of the cabinet and hand to Emily. "Oh, what were you going to do if you fell off that chair?" Emily smiled slyly as she added cereal to her bowl. "I would have been caught." Richard took a sip of his coffee and rolled his eyes. "I think you have too much faith in me." She just shrugged and took the milk. "You're my dad. I want you to catch me." He wasn't expecting the words to hit him the way they did. It wasn't just a passing comment. There was trust in them. Trust that doesn't change. Richard wasn't sure if he had ever been a safety net for someone else. Business people did depend on him, yes. But this was different. He got his coffee and sat down across from her at the bar, shaking off the strange feeling. "What do you plan to do today?" Emily shook her head. "Do you not have work?" He gave a shrug. "I changed the times of my meetings." As she gaped at him, her spoon stopped in the air. "You never change the time." Richard laughed. "It looks like I'm picking up new skills." She looked at him for a moment and then smiled as she tapped her spoon on the bowl's edge. "May I go to the park?" Richard gave me a strange look. "The park?" She gave an excited nod. "You know, fresh air, trees, everyday things that people do." He let out a big sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Okay, it's your fault if I get bored, though." She laughed, clearly happy. In the afternoon, they took their car to Central Park. The air was cool, and golden sunshine shone through the leaves that were still falling. There was a faint hum of city life in the cool air, along with the laughing of kids and the rustling of leaves. Emily ran ahead, chasing pigeons, touching leaves, and picking up acorns like she was on a big journey. Her blonde hair bounced as she explored. Richard followed her more slowly and felt a strange stiffness in his chest as he watched her. This was new to him. He had been measuring his success for years by the amount of money he had in the bank and the amount of power he had in the business world. He had always been in charge and knew how to act at the right time. But as he stood there and watched Emily laugh openly as she spun around in circles under the falling leaves, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Don't ring the phones. No important emails. Right now. Emily ran back to him. She was a little out of breath, and the cool air made her cheeks red. "Oh, I have a very important question." Richard put his arms across his chest. "Let me hear you." She looked up at him with big blue eyes. "Would you let me have a dog?" Richard opened his eyes. "A dog?" Emily happily nodded. "Yes, a little one. Not very big." Rich let out a sigh. "Emily, taking care of a dog is a big job." She put her hands on her hips. "Yes, I am. You still haven't messed that up." Richard looked at her and then laughed. "Wow, using my thinking against me. Good job." She smiled. "The best taught me." Richard shook his head and ran his hand over his face. "Let's talk about it." Emily was happy. "That doesn't mean no." Stupid. He was with her. Richard couldn't help but wonder if this was how life was meant to feel as they walked on. Not scripted, messy, not expected, and yet in some way it's perfect. Emily's eyes were bright with joy. Like a puppy, Richard sighed and rubbed his head. That involved a lot of duty. She stood her ground by folding her arms and lifting her chin. I am at fault. For 2 weeks, I lived by myself. He wasn't ready for how hard that comment hit him. 2 weeks. She had been on her own for 2 weeks, without a parent to turn to for help. His stomach felt tight when he thought about it. Those are bad things for kids to have to do on their own. He let out a breath and looked at her determined face. Let's think about it. Emily let out a huge gasp. No, that's not true. Richard laughed. No, it's not a yes either. She smiled, showing that she was happy about the possibility. They kept walking until they came to a small ice cream cart. Emily insisted on getting the biggest scoop they had. Richard got his own ice cream cone even though he usually doesn't like sticky or messy things. He wasn't keeping track of time this time. His phone wasn't being checked every 5 minutes. He wasn't in a hurry to get to his next meeting or thinking about a meeting of stockholders. He was just there with his daughter, walking through the park. He saw her laugh as she tried to catch ice cream drips on her shirt before they got there. That seemed more important than anything else. With the sun going down, the park got a nice glow from the golden light. Emily slowed down and looked up at him. Hey, Richard. He looked at her funny. Richard. She laughed. What do you mean, Dad? He felt something in his chest get tighter. He didn't know why, but hearing her say Dad made him feel like he had done something bigger than any business deal he had ever made. It was only one word. Easy. Short. That being said, it was the most important thing in his life. He shook his head. Yes. Emily thought about it for a second and then smiled. Today was great. When Richard looked down at her, he saw more than just a child who had come into his life out of the blue. He saw his daughter. He knew something at that very moment. She asked him to be her dad, not just by name or because he was supposed to be, but because she was his family. This was the first time in his life that title felt like it meant something. For most of his life, Richard Wells had been closing deals, negotiating numbers, and building a business that other people admired. He had spent years getting better at being in charge and making sure that nothing in his life was random. He knew for sure that he wouldn't trade this moment for anything else as he watched Emily laugh as she licked the last of her ice cream. Not even a deal worth a few $1 million. He didn't feel like he could measure his success in money or status for the first time. It had nothing to do with money, power, or the next big acquisition. It had to do with this. About a child's trust, the feeling of warmth in his chest when she called him Dad, and the simple but deep joy of seeing someone depend on him for something real, not money or business plans. There's more to Richard's story than just a guy finding out he has a daughter. The story shows how life can take strange turns and how the biggest changes often come from the places we least expect them. At first, Emily had only been a problem that needed to be solved and a task that he needed to figure out how to deal with. But as the days went by, something changed. The more he watched, heard, and learned, the clearer it became. She wasn't getting in the way. She was wonderful. She took him out of his carefully planned world, pushed him past his comfort zone, and changed the way he saw himself. He used to think that being in charge was the key to success, but now he knew that letting go is often the best thing that can happen in life. He might have been okay with that for the first time in his life. This journey is beautiful not because of how dramatic or big it is, but because of how simple it is. Richard doesn't just agree to marry Emily because he has to. He picks her, not because they have to, not because it's the right thing to do. He does it because he wants to. This helps him find unconditional love, which is something that no amount of money, a properly negotiated deal, or a business victory could ever buy. The real deal. The knowledge that spending time with family is the best investment you can make. A house. Not just a house, it's not just a story about a rich man finding out he has a child. This is a story about change, about learning that the things that really matter aren't bank statements or wins in the office, but the people we care about. Richard does more than just give Emily a place to live in the end. He gets one from her. Did this story touch your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, how powerful was this tale? Smash that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story that stirs your soul. For more heart-racing, emotional tales, tap the end screen now.